I was looking at the app I use on my phone to find free items when I came across an ad that was posted in the early morning. Luckily, it was still early and I guess no one else saw it, and the best part was that it was quite literally a mile away. I got there, put it in the back of the van, and then drove home, and here it is. But there was a serious problem with it, and unfortunately, it wasn't the only one we're gonna find either. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very brightly painted lawnmower. And the problem is that according to the ad, the engine runs strong, but the front wheels need to be fixed. Now at first, I thought they were using zip ties to keep the height adjusters in place. But if you do cut them, the front wheels will go out of position, making it almost impossible to push the mower. Now, I'm going to try and repair this lawnmower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Like I said earlier, there are more problems with this mower than just some misaligned front wheels, the first being a broken brake cable. So if they were saying the engine runs strong, how is that even possible with a broken cable? Well, it turns out they bypassed the safety system by using a zip tie in place of the brake cable. Now, I am guilty of using the same method as well. The only difference is that I use it for testing and not as a permanent fix. Now, they didn't mention if the self-propel even works, but with the way the wheels are, I'm guessing it doesn't. So I did try and start the lawnmower the moment I got it out of the back of the van, but with the brake cable bypassed, the choke doesn't work the way that it should. And without a working choke, that means it's not going to start and run, at least the way that it sits right now. That means we'll have to physically prime the engine with some gasoline, and if it does stay running, that'll be great news for us. Now the oil doesn't look too terrible, and after checking its level, it too shows that there's enough in there for a test start. There is, however, only a small amount of gasoline in the fuel tank, but it should be enough for it to run on. So after taking off the air filter, we'll give it some fuel and then try starting it. So the good news is that the engine started and sounded okay, but the bad news is that it did not stay running, which means there could be something wrong with part of the fuel system. There's also quite a lot going on under the mowing deck too. It's quite packed with dirt and grass, which we'll have to remove as well. The other thing is that the blade is on upside down, which unfortunately is a bit of foreshadowing about the rest of the mower. Now you can use a mower with a blade that's been installed upside down, but the grass will look terrible after you're done mowing. Now before we get too far along and find out what all has been messed up or installed backwards on this mower, I'm going to give it a quick spray and rinse. This will hopefully keep us from getting dirt and grass in places where it shouldn't be. Now you don't need to clean a mower before you work on it, but I will say that it does make fixing and filming a lot easier to do. So is it a waste of time to wash a lawnmower before you find out if it's even fixable? Well, I don't think so. However, I do consider ordering new parts before knowing if it is fixable a bit risky to do. So let me explain what I mean. I know that the brake cable is obviously broken and will need to be replaced if I intend on selling it. But the brake system is easily bypassed just like it is now, that way we can test it and see if it is fixable. That means we can still test if the mower works like it should, and if we come up with that conclusion, then we know that's going to be a good investment. The reason I know this is because I've seen a few fixers buy the parts they thought they needed only to find out that the machine was broken beyond repair. Of course, if you have the funds, you can fix most anything, but from a financial perspective, it may not be worth fixing compared to just buying another machine. In the case of this lawnmower, we might end up having to replace the transmission, but surprisingly they are not that expensive. However, we are getting ahead of ourselves. So it's been a couple of hours and most of the water is gone, and it turns out the paint is actually in fantastic shape. That should make it a bit easier to sell this mower if we ever get to that point. Now earlier I mentioned how the choke isn't working, and the reason why is because the brake is bypassed. On this type of choke system, it's based around a timer that slowly opens the choke, but the problem goes even further than that. As you can see, the lever to close the choke isn't working, and on top of that, the choke flap is not closing by itself like it's supposed to. Now part of the reason is because the brake is bypassed, but even after cutting the zip tie, there's still no change. Just to let you know, this emissions hose is a real pain to reconnect, and when we put this back on, you'll understand why, so please don't forget this later on. The plastic insulator also came loose from the engine, which typically means someone's been here before us. Most times when you take off the carb from the engine, the insulator will be stuck to it, but if you bump it enough times, it will come loose. Next, I want to remove the bowl nut and at the same time collect what I can from the carb and see if the fuel might be bad. Now it's really tough to inspect the fuel while it's in this bowl, so I'll pour it into a glass jar instead. Now doing this will give us a better view of the fuel, but what we find is really strange because there's nothing wrong with it. And since the fuel looks good, that must mean there's something wrong with the carb then. So I put the carb back onto the engine just like the way I found it, and it turns out they had the lever for the choke on the wrong side of the arm for the choke. But after putting it on the right side of the arm, the choke now closes like it should, but there's still another issue with it. The choke flap is spring-loaded, and it should open back up when the choke lever is released, but it's not doing that. That means we're going to have to take off the carb for an inspection and possibly a cleaning, which we were going to do anyway. But this time, we'll have to see why the flap is sticking. Hopefully we can fix it, otherwise we'll have to get a new carb. First, we're going to see what the fuel bowl looks like, and surprisingly, it looks to be in excellent condition. Now the float is moving like it should, so maybe the main fuel jet is clogged and not allowing any fuel to get to the engine then. Next, we'll unscrew the jet out of the pickup tube and then carefully free it from the carb. The strange part is that the jet is not clogged at all and shows no signs of any issues. However, the jet does not need to be completely clogged to keep the engine from starting. So just to be sure, I'm going to use my cleaning wires to try and make it as clear as possible. I'll even use some carb cleaner to finish it off. I'm not sure if it made enough of a difference, but it's as good as it's going to get. Now, I have received some comments about making this opening bigger, but I'm going to leave it the way that it is. We'll then take out the emulsion tube and see if any of the openings are clogged up, but it looks like they're clear as well. But just to make sure, I'll go through each opening and then finish it off with a blast from the carb cleaner. The last thing that I want to check is the pilot jet, which is under this bolt on top of the carb, and what we find might explain our problem. So it looks like there's a mass of dry grass and dirt blocking the jet, and the best way to clear it is to spray the opening at the front of the carb. So here's some of what flew out of the opening for that bolt, and as you can see, it's just a tangle of organic debris. Once the jet is mostly cleared, we'll then spray some carb cleaner directly into the jet and then move on to the last part. The last thing that I want to check is the needle and float, just to make sure that there are no issues with either of them. And after taking out the float and needle, I don't see any problems with either one. So I'll just give all the openings a quick spray of carb cleaner for good measure and then put the carb back together. I almost forgot, I need to find out why the choke flap is sticking. Now you could just try and spray carb cleaner or a thin lube around the pivoting and contact points, but most times that won't work. Instead, it's best to pull out the choke flap from the shaft and then remove the shaft from the carb. That way, it'll make cleaning both the shaft and the opening a lot better versus what we were trying to do earlier. Once out, you can see the dirt clinging to the shaft, and that means there's probably a lot more in the opening too. After cleaning the opening, we'll then spray off the shaft, and then once it's clean enough, we'll start to put the carb back together again. Now, instead of going through all this hassle and also the risk of messing something up in the carb, the other option would have been to just replace it. If you've never done something like taking a carb apart and would rather use that time on something more productive, then just order a carb kit with all the extras for about 20 bucks. Now, there's nothing wrong with admitting that you're going to take the easy way out, especially if you end up selling it and making your money back. Now, for those of you who didn't know it, I do have an ultrasonic cleaner waiting in the wings, but this carb simply wasn't bad enough to need it. Besides that, using an ultrasonic cleaner requires me to clean off the dirt on the body of the carb before I even put it in there. Plus, when the long cleaning cycle is done, there's still a bit more work that needs to be done with the carb. So sometimes it's just easier to go old school with the cleaning, as it takes less time than waiting for an ultrasonic to do its job. Now, if you do have an ultrasonic cleaner, then by all means get your money's worth out of it and use it as much as possible. So remember what I said about how easy it was to forget to connect that emissions hose back up? Well, here's the reason why. For this part of the repair, you have to hold the airbox along with the bolts that go through it and the rest of the assembly as well. And because it's not easy to do this part, most are just focused on stabbing the bolts back into the engine, and most just seem to forget about that hose in the background. The reason I know this is because I've been guilty of not connecting that hose before and only realized it later on. You also have to make sure that the lever for the choke arm is also in the correct location, otherwise the choke won't work. Once the carb is back on and before the air filter goes on, we'll put some fuel in the tank and check for leaks. Now, while we wait for the leaks to show up, we can also check and make sure that the choke system is working like it should be. So what's supposed to happen is that you move the choke lever to the starting position, and it should keep the choke closed until you close the brake handle. Then the choke will slowly release itself, giving you time to start the engine. And as you can see, it did exactly what it's supposed to do, meaning we should be able to start this engine once we get finished putting it back together. Now, there's still the matter with the brake cable, but I think I have a solution to that problem, and it's rather low tech, but it's also free. For the purpose of testing, I'm going to reuse an old pull rope from an earlier repair. I'll just put it through the opening in the lever and then tie it to the brake handle. And as you can see, it's working perfectly along with the choke system. The last thing to do is to sharpen the blade, and more importantly, to use a blade balancer afterwards. Making sure that the blade is balanced should help to keep the engine working well for a long time. And in a later video, I'm going to show you what could happen to your engine if your blade goes out of balance. The last thing we need to do is to, of course, replace the blade, choke the carb, and then hopefully pull the rope until it starts. And if it doesn't start, we'll have to start looking elsewhere for a problem. So we've got a lot to talk about, but first, let's see if it'll start back up after running for about 5 minutes. So the good news is that it started back up, but the better news is that I wasn't standing in front of the mower when the branch fell down. If you couldn't tell, it's very windy out here, and working under a tree might not have been the best idea. So what happened during the test run? Well, the engine did take 3 pulls to start back up when hot, so we might have to check the valve lash. But the biggest news is that only one of the wheels wants to spin while the other one tries to. So we could have a problem with the teeth on one of the wheels, but I think the transmission itself is working like it should be. That means we'll have to investigate what's going on with that one wheel, and if it's fixable, we can consider replacing the broken cable. But if there's more wrong with that end of the transmission, it'll make things a lot more difficult, mainly due to the extra cost. So my question is, do you think it'll be worth it to continue spending more time on this project, or do you think it's going to cost too much to fix and that I should just sell it as a push mower instead? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.